We've got it clicked.
We're set. All right.
Can you tell if I did that correctly?
Yeah, I can see the recording button at the top.
Great.
Thank you.
Hey, good.
Well, welcome. Good evening, everybody, to the first in a 8-month-long series. Now, if you got scared by that, you're not going to be here for 8 months. You have another month before the next one. But we're glad that you all are able to join us tonight. Excited about all the new people that are here that are not part of our regular membership. So thank you for taking some time out of your evening to join us. I want to tell you just a little bit about our club, and then we'll talk about some guidelines for the rest of the presentation this evening, so that hopefully I won't speak too much here and we can get to the good stuff and let Gale share with you some of his experience and his wealth of photography knowledge. The Brentwood Photography Group is based in Brentwood, Tennessee, and when we're meeting in person, we meet at the Otter Creek Church. And obviously right now we are not able to meet in person, so we're just like everybody else using Zoom for pretty much everything. But despite the pandemic, we've still been a very active group. We have at least twice a month meetings. We have a main meeting on the first Tuesday of each month, and then a mini clinic on the second Thursday of each month. And we've been fortunate with the pandemic because of Zoom to have access to a wealth of speakers that we normally wouldn't have access to because of just the inability for them to travel to Middle Tennessee, for example. And so far this year, we've already had a couple of really great speakers that we would not have had access to previously. So there is an upside to having Zoom as our primary way of interacting with each other. But we also are using this as an opportunity to still do some outdoor events. And so typically on the third Saturday of each month, we have some sort of a socially distanced outdoor opportunity where we get to get out and kind of sort of see each other and also learn from each other and also learn about some interesting places where we can take some photographs. So all of those things that I have mentioned so far are things that are restricted to our membership. So if you are interested in becoming a member or would just like to learn a little bit more, you can either ask me in the chat or you can email Gale when you get the emails from him. And also the page, the Photography Basics page, actually has some more information on how you can become a member. But we would love to have you join our group so that you can continue on your photography journey. But we're glad that you're here this evening. And with that, I will just tell you that for the rest of this evening, you will not be hearing from me. You'll be hearing from Gale, who has actually this is his second year doing this class for us, and just an absolutely fantastic photographer, great speaker, great teacher. Last year, the same class was limited to our membership as we were still trying to figure out Zoom. And we have members that have been doing photography longer than I have been alive. I love saying that, but it just means that we have a wealth of knowledge that people are willing to share. And many of them said they learned something from the basics class. So even though it's basic, there is still some advanced things that you will be able to take away from tonight. And we hope that you'll continue with us for the rest of the series. And the last little bit of housekeeping is I'll be watching the chat window because of the number of participants that we have. Let's try to use the chat window for any questions that you have. And I'll work with Gale to find some opportunities for us to raise those questions to him. We'll also have some opportunity for you to all ask questions, but just again, because of the number of people, if you can put them in the chat window, that'll probably be the easiest way for us to coordinate everything and get your questions answered. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Gale.
All right. Appreciate it, Jeremy. First of all, thank you for taking the time out, your personal busy schedules to attend on at nighttime. And I appreciate your dedication to the art of photography. And I know I'm talking to 3 different groups of individuals this evening. As people were registering and signing up for this particular class, many of you responded to the question of what was your skill level? How would you rate that in photography? And there were quite a few that said, I'm a beginner. I just got my first camera. I just started photography a few months ago, and I'd like to know what I'm supposed to do with all these dials and buttons on the camera. And so we have several that are in that category. This is the perfect class for you this evening. Several of you also said that you were somewhat experienced, that you had been photographing for several years, but you know that there's a lot more that you could learn. And if you're like me, when you attend a workshop or any kind of a training session, I always walk away with at least one idea or one reminder of something that I should be doing that maybe I forgot to do. And then there is several people, quite a few actually, that said, I'm very experienced. I've been photographing for 40 plus years. Maybe I'm a semi-professional. And for this group that fall into that category, I would say that I'm giving you an opportunity for the next several minutes to be able to say to yourself, and that's because we've got you muted, but to be able to say to yourself, gee, I already know that, or I'm already doing that. So we can just, so you can affirm that, that you've got it all figured out. So hopefully tonight we'll give you a little bit of information for all three of the groups that are here. And so we're going to jump in. I want to make sure, hopefully I get this squared away and bring up, okay, that looks, I think that's what I want. And I just, if someone could just nod your head saying that you see.
Looks good, Gale.
Okay, good. All right, then we're on the right track. We talked about knowing your camera. And again, this is going to be a very basics class. But I think it's important to know that when you're doing photography, that camera is your primary tool. And with any tool that you have or that you use, you need to know how to use it. You need to understand it. You need to know what the features are of your particular camera, and what those features are and how to use them, how to change some of the settings, and that's what tonight is all about. Whether you're shooting landscape photography, or maybe you're doing a portrait or lifestyle action shots. I've started off for years. People would say that, well, Gale Stoner, he's the landscaping guy. And that might be because I primarily show that on social media. And when you go to my website, I've got quite several galleries, is what I'm trying to say, that reference to landscape. But I've over the last couple of years, I've really started doing action shots and a lot of high school sports. And I love that challenge. I love trying to capture that moment. So whether I'm shooting action or I'm shooting landscape or still life, the settings that you would use for your camera will be different. When I'm doing landscape, I've got certain settings that I automatically go to. I make my adjustment to my aperture. I've set it at a certain shutter speed for the lighting conditions and the white balance and all the things that we're going to touch on tonight, if you're not real familiar with all of those. But that's different than when I'm shooting portrait. I just did a portrait session last evening, and so I'm using my strobe lights. Totally different settings on the camera in that situation. So you need to know your camera well enough that when you have to make those adjustments, that it's an easy thing for you to do. If you're in front of a client and you say, well, okay, I need to change my my ISO, and you're having to fumble around a little bit and go, hang on just a minute, let me find where I make that change or how to change it. You're going to have perhaps a frustrated client. Or maybe it's not a client, maybe you're doing landscape, but you're out with a photography group and you're telling everybody, hey, hang on, I've got to figure out how to make this change before I take the shot. And so very important to understand, what would you want to change and how do you do it? I would also want to say that what camera you have, it's probably good enough. Uh, you know, a $200 digital camera is going to allow you to take as good of pictures, relatively speaking, as good of pictures as that $2,000 camera. A lot of people are into gears. Uh, I'm a gear person. I like to have the latest and the greatest if my budget will allow. It tends not to let me do that as much as I would like. But you know, if you've got a 18 megapixel camera and you're thinking, gee, if I were to buy this other camera that has 26 megapixel, or even better, this camera has 50 megapixel, and that's going to give you a better picture. Probably not. It still requires you to have a subject to shoot. You have to have control of the lighting, which requires the settings on your camera. But the cost of the camera, how fancy it is not a guarantee you'll have a better picture. I tend to I'm a Fuji guy now. I was a Canon guy for about 20 years, and then switched over to Fuji. And I'm looking at, because I'm speaking to myself right now, I'm looking at the newest Fuji, which is a 100 megapixel camera, and it's the newest version, but it's like $6,000. And so I'm thinking, okay, I could go from 26 megapixel, which my camera is only a few months old, and I'm happy with what it gives me. But boy, would my pictures be better if it was 100 megapixel. Um, but I buy that camera. I'm buying the lenses to go with it because it's a totally different set of lenses. And by the time it's all said and done, I probably got 10 grand invested. Uh, and there's a lot of reasons why that probably is not going to happen. But that would be my wish list. But the reality is that camera would not give me better pictures unless I'm going to be printing all of my stuff at 4 foot by 6 foot and hanging it on a wall. That might make a difference. But if you're posting on social media, if you're doing 5x7 prints, 8x10s, you know, your camera is good enough. So, so I just want to get that out of the way. Why not be on auto mode? For many of you that said you are beginners, some of you went so far as to say, I'm afraid to get off of auto mode. And I'm going to try to dispel the fear or the anxiety that you might have in getting off of auto. But when you're on auto mode, there's a couple of things that are going on. Your camera is making decisions for you, and it does a pretty good job. I mean, that camera has a computer in it. Now I'm talking all digital cameras now, but it does have a computer. And when you're on auto mode, the camera is deciding your basic settings. When you point that camera at a subject, based on the amount of light that you have, what the lighting conditions are, what time of the day it is, what the subject is that you're shooting, it's deciding for you what the shutter speed should be, what the aperture, the depth of field, it's deciding what should be in focus. And it may pick correctly and it may not. The white balance, and again, the ISO, which we'll get you familiar with all of that in a few minutes. But if you're okay with letting the camera make all those decisions, you know, auto is going to work. But I would say that for those of you that's in this class tonight, the 70% or so, or even higher, that are saying, I want to get off of auto, then this is the right class. I don't want the camera making decisions for me. I want to have that option. But I would also say that there are people who should stay on auto mode. There is a good friend of mine, a couple that does a lot of traveling, and So they're always taking snapshots, all those travel, and then they come back and she'll have a book printed by Shutterfly or something, some company like that. But her comment before they went on their last trip last fall was the pictures never look the same as what we saw when we were there. Uh, and I don't know why. Or she also made the comment, I found out that I can take just as good of pictures with my phone as what I'm getting with the camera, and sometimes even better with the phone. She mentioned that a friend of hers who also does a lot of traveling, her pictures are fantastic, but mine never look that way. And she said, so I want to buy a new camera, one that a good one. And so within her budget, and she bought, I think it was about a $600 camera. It would do anything and everything for any of us. And she said, okay, now I've got this, I got it out of the box. What do I do with it? You know, and I said, well, you can put it on auto and let it do everything for you, which that was a mistake. I should never have said that. And I said, but if you want to spend about an hour, I'll go over the basics with you and see what we can do. And that's what we did. And she understood what we went through, things that we're talking about tonight. She said, oh, I see how this works. When I change this, I see how this darkens the picture, lightens the picture, et cetera. And so off on vacation they go. When she came back, our first meeting, I said, so how did that go? She said, I hated it. She said, I put the camera back in the bag about an hour after I started using it. And she said, I never got it out again. She said, there was too many things I had to think about. And so it was just easier to just take pictures with the phone. And so that'll be a camera that'll probably be on eBay very shortly. And you'll probably get a good price on that one. I would suggest that the individual that should stay on auto mode is the person who does not have the patience. And she's a great friend of ours. She is not a patient person. She spent an hour trying to figure out what the camera would do. And I think she understood all of that. But it does require spending more time, certainly get more familiar with the camera. And a person who is willing to compromise on the quality of the pictures, and that's okay if that's what a person is willing to do. Or if they're willing to say, my pictures aren't as good as what I want them to be, but I'm willing to live with it, then stay with the phone or just stay on auto. And there is a handful of people that works best for them. But I know that those that tuned in tonight, you're not in that category. So that's why we're going to talk about the basics and things that you should be very familiar with if you want to get the best quality image that you can from your camera. We're going to talk about selecting your priority mode. You need to know what the priority modes are and why I would select one over the other, and we'll cover that. You need to know, how do you change the aperture? On my camera, that aperture is a ring that's on my lens. Some cameras, there's a dial somewhere on the body of the camera. How do you change the shutter speed? How do you change the ISO? Very important to be able to know exactly where those are and to know when you would make those adjustments. The white balance can be important to the quality of the picture. Needing to know how to, do I want to be on single focus, which means I focus on one subject, I hit the shutter button, click, I've got a picture. Or am I shooting something that's moving? Maybe I'm shooting my kid or grandchild's soccer game, and my grandson is running back and forth and is running close near to me and is running away from me. And if you're in single focus and you lock in on the focus at them and they're 10 feet from you, but they suddenly run away, now they're 20 feet away and you hit the shutter button, they're not going to be in focus. Continuous says that focus point, when it's on the subject, let's say it's on the player, no matter what their distance is from you, being on continuous, they'll still stay in focus. And then, of course, so would I go into manual focus? And again, it depends on what the subject is. If I'm doing particularly flowers, and that's coming up, hopefully that's coming up fairly soon. I will always be on manual focus when I'm shooting flowers or doing macro type photography. And then selecting when the focus point. Uh, you should know where that button or dial is to be able to move that focus point around. And I'm definitely going to cover more of this in a few minutes. And then where's the 2-second, 10-second timer? Not that you're doing selfies, but if I'm doing landscape or flowers or macro photography, I'm usually on a tripod, number one. Rarely do I handhold unless I'm doing sports. But if I'm on a tripod, I'm going to set my 2-second timer for my standard lenses, no matter what the subject is. Because when you push that shutter button, you're introducing vibration or motion to that camera, no matter how steady you think you are. And so I want to push the shutter button, move my hands, move them away, and give 2 seconds for that camera and tripod to settle down, and then get a nice clean shot. If I'm using my long telephoto lens, which is heavier, then I'm going to go to 10 seconds to give the camera and the tripod and the lens more time to settle down before the shutter actually clicks. So you need to know how to access these various areas. Two primary areas we're going to spend most of the time on tonight, and that's the priority mode, aperture, shutter, and ISO. We'll touch on the others, but this is really the main focus is going to be in these two areas. So getting the desired results. What allows you to get the correct exposure? Well, it's a combination, in combination and together, these three areas, the aperture, shutter, and the ISO, they work hand in hand. None of these three work totally independently. You change one, you're affecting another one, probably another one, might even affecting the other two. So the correct exposure is dependent on the correct combination of aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. And let's talk about the difference between the aperture and the shutter speed and how that affects your exposure. And again, really going to get right down to the very basics here. The aperture is the amount of light. When you adjust the aperture, you're adjusting the amount. And that's what's important to understand. It's the amount of light that's coming through the lens and hitting the sensor in your camera. Now, when we talk about the sensor, we're talking about, it would have been film years ago, but now it's the sensor. But so aperture is the amount of light coming in. The shutter speed is the duration of that amount of light. How long are we letting that light come through and hit the sensor? So between the amount and for how long, that is determining your correct exposure. So again, they go hand in hand. And usually, again, I want to emphasize, when you change one, you are probably changing the other one. And the aperture, just like the eye, I couldn't think of a better example. In fact, one of my grandkids helped me decide to use this as an example. And but the aperture is like the iris in your eye. You're indoors. You walk outside on a bright sunny day. The iris gets smaller, and it's letting less light in, so that you're not blinded. And you see that pupil, the little black part of your eye suddenly gets really small. And at the same time, just opposite of that, you walk into a dimly lit room, or you walk outside in the evening, and the iris is going to expand. It's going to get bigger. It's going to allow more light in. So again, it's the amount, whether the iris is small or whether it's large. The amount of light, that's the aperture. Okay. If you're a note taker, you might want to write that one down. It's the amount. Little scale here that I took off social media, and I thought it was a very good example of what that aperture is. The aperture is often referred to as the f-stop. And they say f-stop is because it is a scale. And if you look at this example, and again, as you can see, it says it controls the amount of light. The f-stop is really a way of predicting how open is the lens, the opening on your lens, the amount that's coming through and hitting the sensor. If you notice at f2.8, you've got a lot of light coming through the lens. And as you work your way down to f16, it's getting less and less amount of light coming through. The average lens will usually go even beyond f16 to an f22 is pretty standard. So that's very little amount of light coming in. And now it took me a while to get my brain wrapped around this. In my simple approach to life is that, to me, the larger the opening should be the bigger the number. But as you notice here, this is not a misprint. It's the bigger the number. 16 is a smaller aperture than the f4. So if you can, to me, it's almost reversed. But I didn't design the f-stop scale. It controls the amount of light. But the aperture does one other thing that is equally important. Not only does it control the amount of light, but it also affects the depth of field, the amount of that's in focus in your picture, from the nearest to the camera lens to the furthest away. That would be a big depth of field. If what is in focus is nearest to the camera and only 4 or 5 feet away, and beyond that is out of focus, then you've got a shallow depth of field. So the aperture is primarily used for experienced photographers. It's primarily used to control depth of field, but at the same time, it is impacting the exposure, the amount of light coming in. Okay. For example, here is now when you're talking about a rough on a golf course, this is a rough, and your ball hit one of these rocks and there's no telling where it's going to go and how far. But when I took this shot, I wanted the blades of grass and the front edge of that rock in the foreground. I wanted that to be in focus. I also wanted that pump house that's midway back in the picture. I wanted that to also be in focus. So I wanted that rough to be as sharp as possible. F16 allowed me to do that. Okay. Again, smaller amount of light coming through, but it gave me a nice depth of field. F11 on this shot, the foliage right there in the foreground is in focus, as well as the barn in the distance. So F11 gave me that. Typically, when you're taking pictures of people, if you're doing portrait work, the standard is when you're taking a picture of people, you want all the attention on the face of the person and not be distracted by things in the background. And that's why you typically go with a shallow depth of field, as shallow as possible. And I had a lens that was at f2.8. So that's a big, wide open aperture and a very, very shallow depth of field. If you look at the right eye on my granddaughter, and this was, she's 17 now, so she'd be embarrassed if I was showing this, but her right eye is in focus. How shallow the depth of field is, look at the leaf that she's holding. Just a matter of inches closer to the camera, and it's out of focus. So very shallow depth of field. This one I was experimenting. This horse had to be wondering, what is he doing? But with this lens, I had to, it would open up to 1.8. Very, very shallow depth of field. The eye was the only thing that I wanted the viewer to put the attention on, was the eye and the eyelash. And so as you can see, extremely shallow depth of field, but allowing a lot of light to come through because it's really wide open. Okay. And I'm going to keep going until Jeremy thinks it's time to stop and ask questions. So I'll
Gale,
let that be.
do you cover manual focus later on in this lesson?
No.
Okay.
No, I do not.
Okay.
That's
We'll
going
have
to be in, I think that's in lesson number 3, I think. It will
Okay.
be covered in another class.
All right. So Bob that asked the question, if you want to message me and let me know if you want me to wait for that towards the end of this lesson today, or if you think you'll be back for the follow-up lesson in session 3.
Okay. Yeah, just I mean, if it's if you'd like to get an answer, or I'll try to give you an answer now, that's fine, or we can do. But I know we cover that in another class. Okay. All right. Again, I'll keep going until somebody tells me to stop. Okay. So the aperture is like it's the opening and closing, the amount of light coming through the lens. Shutter speed is again, I'll relate it to the eye. It's like the blinking of the eye. The shutter speed, when you're looking at the numbers, you're looking at, generally speaking, you're looking at a fraction of a second. For example, a fast blink, which is probably a normal blink, which let's say would be equivalent to maybe like 5/100ths of a second. That's a very short amount of time for light to be coming in and hitting the sensor. Which says at 5/100ths of a second, you need a bigger aperture. You need a greater amount of light coming in for the correct exposure at 5/100ths of a second. If you were to go to a 1,000ths of a second, you need even a bigger aperture, a bigger opening in your lens. A slow blink equivalent to a setting on a camera might be like a 60th of a second. And then, of course, you could have staring, which you got to be careful with that. That could be a little creepy. But that would be more equivalent to maybe like a 30-second exposure. And most cameras will allow you to set your camera up to 30 seconds. And then some have a feature that you could even go beyond 30 seconds. So again, you're looking at fractions of a second. And then you can get as slow as into like 1 second, 5 seconds, etc. Okay, so that's the shutter speeds. What would you use to determine your shutter speed? How much are you wanting to freeze the action? When I'm doing the sports, I want to freeze the action. Certainly, I want to try to catch expressions of the players. I like this shot. I just wish the player that's sliding in, I wish their helmet was still a little bit higher on their head so I could see their eyes. That would have been a much, much better picture. In fact, I think it's class number 6 that we're going to be talking about sports and action photography. At 1/2000th of a second, it definitely froze the action. If you look at the upper, just off center to the right, toward the top, you'll see a little white or a little tan speck. That's a piece of dirt that we stopped the motion. There's another piece just to the left of the player's ponytail. And so 2000s was fast enough to even stop that action. You're wanting to stop the prop on an airplane, you got to go with fast shutter speed. And maybe the faster, the better. But this is, again, an example of 2000ths of a second. Where I shoot high school sports in this gymnasium, the lighting is really poor. And I think I've been told a lot of high school gyms are. But I can shoot at 1,000ths of a second. I'm using a lens that's f2, and f2 is a pretty big aperture. And so I'm able to shoot at 1,000s, and 1,000s will freeze the action good enough for me. But, and a little side note, I'm shooting at f2. You'll notice what my depth of field is. I'm focused on the player that's going up for the layup, but the fans in the background are blurred out. And that's what I want. I want a shallow depth of field when I'm shooting sports. But that also allowed me to go to 1,000th of a second. You don't have to always go to 1,000th. I mean, I was freezing the water droplets on this shot of the wave crashing in the rock at 5/100ths of a second. And then you can get really experimental, typical river in the Smokies, and shot it at 3.5 seconds. And, when you have motion, that motion is going to get blurred the longer that shutter is open. And which is what allowed the water to get that milky look. So 3.5 seconds. So here's a little tip, even perhaps for the more experienced, maybe in the amateur category. Important to know what is your minimum shutter speed that you can hand hold. If you're not on a tripod, what can you hold? When I was significantly younger, I could easily hand hold at 1/30th of a second. 60th of a second was a no-brainer. I mean, I was very, very steady. And so, I mean, everything was good. I'm a little bit older now, and my minimum shutter speed, I rely on 125th of a second, just about double the shutter speed as far as speed. Sometimes I can go down to 100ths of a second if I haven't had a lot of coffee that day. But I do know that if I go below 100th of a second, I'm running the risk of introducing motion to the picture. And when you have motion in the picture, now you've got a blurry picture. So again, that's why it's important for you just to experiment. What is your minimum shutter speed that you can be very reliable in hand holding? And that minimum shutter speed can change with the lens that you're using. If you're using a wide angle lens, you could probably go with a slower shutter speed than you could use with a telephoto lens, because the long lens is going to introduce more motion. But know what your minimum shutter speed is. Again, I know what mine is, and so as I'm adjusting my aperture, if my shutter speed drops below my minimum, if it drops below 100ths of a second, then I have to make some changes. But this feature makes life a lot easier. Image stabilization. I think if I'm not mistaken, I think Nikon calls it VR. I think it's vibration reduction. Or again, it's image stabilization for a lot of the cameras. And that simply means it's either built into the lens or it's built into the camera. There's like a little gyro that's in there that when you flip this on, either turn it on the lens, or it may already be in the camera body, that it slows everything down to where you can go with a slower shutter speed. To go back to my example, personal example of me at 100ths of a second with the camera I have now, when I turn that stabilization feature on, I have now been able to go down to 1/20th of a second and be very consistent in getting very tack sharp pictures. And that, for me personally, that's unheard of. I mean, I was never able to do that before. So if you find yourself having to go below your minimum handheld shutter speed and you have image stabilization on the lens or in the camera, turn it on. And then make sure you turn it off before you start shooting action shots, because then that can kind of throw you off a little bit. So we talked about aperture priority or shutter priority. Which one would you select? Well, before you have to make that decision, let me repeat something I said earlier. Everything is combined. You change one, you're affecting the other. When you're an aperture priority, your camera will automatically adjust the shutter speed to maintain the correct exposure. If you're in shutter priority, and as you're changing your shutter speed up and down, your camera is automatically adjusting the aperture. And of course, if you're in manual mode, that's a whole different ball game. That's a different class. So again, when affecting one, you're affecting the other. So I am typically shooting in aperture. And when I'm doing even sports, which, controlling motion and stopping motion is important. But I also want a shallow depth of field. I don't want the fans in the background to be a distraction. I'm going to typically go with aperture priority, particularly for landscapes and travel photography, because I want everything in that picture from front to back to be sharp in focus, unless I'm photographing a person, of course. Or if I'm shooting something and stopping the motion is the most important thing, then I might switch over to the shutter, because I know changing one is going to change the other. So you just have to make that determination. What am I shooting and what's most important? If you're shooting in dim light, and this is a common challenge. Let's say it's you were shooting a family reunion and it's gone all day. Sun is going down. There's no lights at the park. We are observing social distancing, so everybody's yelling across at everybody to have a conversation. But you're shooting in dim light, and you say, okay, I need to decrease my shutter speed, and I decrease my shutter speed to give me so I can go with a bigger aperture, but I'm still, when I take the shot, I'm still underexposed. Or I'm an aperture priority and I open up my aperture as wide as it will go. And I'm still at my minimum shutter speed, but I'm still underexposed. So where do I go from there? I mean, what do I do now? I mean, I could decrease my shutter speed dramatically, but then I risk not getting a clean shot. I might have some vibration, some motion. So where do I go from there? There is another dial, another tool in the toolbox, and that's the ISO dial that's very often underused or forgotten. And it's got to make them feel sad that it is forgotten. So the ISO dial, here's what it's going to do. The ISO will increase the available range of the shutter speed, whatever that may be, or the aperture. And by increasing the range, let me show you how that would work. This has got to be a Canon camera because the shutter speed in the upper left-hand corner says TV. So that's time value. And so I'm pretty sure that's our Canon. But this is the typical screen that you would see on the back of your camera, all of your settings. And we won't look at all, we won't talk about most of these. I just want to talk about a couple of things at the top. What's in the green box is your built-in light meter. And your digital cameras will have that. You can see that on the back of the camera, and you can see that somewhere if you have it set in your settings, you can see this in your viewfinder. And so a couple of things we've set. Number one, I'm at 250th of a second. I don't want to go any slower than that because I'm trying to capture my kid's baseball game. And if he gets a hit, he's running to first base, I want to freeze the action. He's a slow runner, so 250th of a second will stop the motion for him. If you'll notice, I have an aperture, an f-stop of 3.5. that's as wide open as I can go. So my lens is limited to that maximum aperture. In addition, I have my camera set at ISO 100. Now, in a perfect world, we would have our ISO set at the smallest number possible, because that's going to give you the cleanest picture, the clearest and sharpest picture. Even in the digital world, digital cameras, there's something that is often referred to as noise. And we'll address that here in just a moment. So at ISO 100, which is my perfect world ISO number, it's the lowest my camera will go. Some will go down to 50. But at that, I look at my light meter and I notice that I'm on the minus side of average. The average, the zero, would be my ideal exposure. Right now, my camera, when I take a picture, is going to be too dark. But I can't change my shutter speed and I can't open up my lens any wider because that's all my lens will do. So where do I go from here? That's where you use the ISO. Let's say that we change the ISO from 100 to 400. Now, where the picture is not as dark, still too dark, it's still underexposed, but it's going in the correct direction. Okay, still underexposed. Why don't we change it? And I'll move it up to 800 ISO. Now I've got a correct exposure. I'm maintaining my shutter speed that I wanted. I'm still at my aperture that I wanted. And I now have the picture that I wanted. And I did all of that by just turning the dial on the ISO. Okay. Any questions, anything, Jeremy, up to this point?
Yeah, I think it would be worthwhile going back and talking again briefly on how aperture priority, how you might want to set up a scenario. So I'm thinking if we're talking about somebody who has their camera set on aperture priority and they want a shallow depth of field, let's say f2.8, what other things does that change? Because I think I could think back to when I first started shooting, when people talked about f-stops versus aperture settings. It's like, okay, what does that mean? Well, we're talking about the same thing here. So sometimes those words that get used interchangeably cause a little bit of confusion. So maybe just kind of touching on that again.
Okay. Again, the f-stop, the number is going to represent how big the opening is, the amount of light. Now, this example right here, we're at 3.5. If I were to take this lens off and I put on a lens that was an f2, which is what I shoot when I do the sports in the gym. So I'm at f2. That gives me a much bigger aperture from 3 to 5, going to f2, much bigger amount of light coming in, and it allows that shutter speed, instead of 250th of a second for the amount of light at 3.5, now for the amount of light at f2, that shutter speed might go from 250 up to 500. So my camera has suddenly said, you put on a lens with a bigger aperture at f2, my shutter speed just increased. Nothing else has changed. I'm still keeping a correct exposure, but now if there's a ball hit in the air, and maybe now at 500ths of a second, I'm going to actually be able to read the label on the ball if I get close enough. So again, adjusting the aperture can affect the shutter speed and allow the shutter to be faster. If I'm at 3.5, but for some, and that gives me as shallow a depth of field as I can get with this lens. But let's say I just took a shot, or I'm wanting to take a shot of an individual, and there's something behind them, about 5 feet behind them, that I still would like to have in focus. Maybe it's their company name, their sign, or a product that they sell. So I'm going to increase my my depth of field. I'm going to go to maybe from 3.5, maybe to F5. And when I do that, I'm going to get a greater depth of field. More things are in focus, but by decreasing the amount of light coming in, my shutter speed may have just dropped from 1/250th of a second down to maybe like 80th of a second. So it is going to be a slower shutter speed. If you can hand hold, or if you're on a tripod, it doesn't really matter. But if you're hand holding, if you can hold it steady at an 80th of a second, you've got a slower shutter speed, but you're still going to have an effective picture. So hopefully that's a little clearer. And if not, I think we're gonna have a little time. I'll take questions at the end and hang around as long as we need to.
Yeah, that's a difficult subject to kind of wrap your head around when you
It,
first
it,
get introduced to it.
yeah. And here's what, I think I've got a slide on this, but I'm gonna throw it in now, okay? So, and here's what I'm gonna suggest. You need to get outside in normal light, daylight, get somewhere, find you a subject to focus on, and start somewhere. Start it, maybe even be on auto, and push your shutter button halfway down and see what the settings are. And then take your priority mode off of auto and put it on aperture and start changing the aperture. Just play with it and watch. Keep looking at your subject, look through the viewfinder or the LCD screen, and start moving your f-stop up or down, and watch what is happening to your shutter speed. And you can start seeing the relationship. So to me, spending 15 minutes just watching what it does can really kind of clarify what is, as you say, Jeremy, can be a little difficult in dialogue. Again, same subject. Switch it to shutter priority. Start changing your shutter speeds and watch what happens to your f-stop, and see what that interaction really is. If you
Gale,
want to go a step further, you can set your ISO to auto and make adjustments to either your shutter speed or your f-stop or aperture. Change those and watch what changes are made to your ISO. The camera will figure that out for you. And I'm going to give you an example of that here, I think, in just a moment. So my big tip at this point is you just got to sit down with it and just play with it for a couple of minutes, and just watch what happens to the numbers. I mean, we know what the shutter speed represents. We know what the numbers represent. We've gone over that. We know what the f-stop represents, bigger or smaller opening amount of light and the amount of light coming in. We know what that means. Just start adjusting one or the other and see what the other one does. Okay.
Gil, another thing that I found really helpful when I first started out, when I talk about shutter speed, was someone said, get yourself in front of a ceiling fan and change your shutter speed so that you can freeze it so that you can see the blades are nice and crisp, and then slow it down so that you get just that little bit of a blur to show the action. If you can do that, sort of an exercise that helps you understand how much of a difference the shutter speed can have an impact on the type of picture you're wanting to take.
Great
and
idea.
both are appropriate. There's nothing wrong with a blurry fan because it might convey motion. But sometimes you want it to be super crisp because you want to see the details.
Well, exactly right. When I'm shooting baseball, sometimes I will find my ideal shutter speed to freeze the action, and then I'll slow it down. So maybe 800ths of a second will freeze the action, and you can see the stitching on the baseball that the pitcher is getting ready to throw. And then, but I'll go from 800ths of a second, and I might go down a little slower because I want to see a little bit of blur in the arm of the pitcher to show that he's actually not posing, but that he's actually pitching, that there is some motion. So, it's just whatever you're looking for. But again, you could, have your dog or your cat run around the house and try to take a picture of them and see which one freezes the action and which one's, at what speed do you need to freeze the action of that subject. You're not hurting anything. You can't break anything in the camera. So just experiment. And that's the best way of doing it. You just got to spend the time. It doesn't take a lot of time to figure. I mean, in 10 minutes of playing around with the shutter speed, you're gonna know what shutter speed I know to stop the fan and what shutter speed I know to stop the motion of the legs on my dog running past me. And so you know what that is. Okay. There's a conversation among photographers about ISO and noise. The higher the ISO, the more noise you're introducing to the picture. And by noise, we're just talking about the grittiness or a little bit of texture to the picture. And so people can get overly concerned about noise. Well, if I go from 100 ISO, which is the best that I can get, but I've got to go to 800 ISO because of the lighting, gee whiz, 800, I'm going to have noise. And so I probably don't want to take the picture. Well, yeah, you do. And I'll show you why. Let me give you a couple of examples. And it doesn't have anything to do with, maybe a little bit with my camera, but in some of these examples. At ISO 100, in fact, my Fuji camera only goes down to 160. And which I don't miss that other 60 less ISO at all. But at ISO 100, this was on my Canon, there's no noise. I mean, it is as crisp and as clear as you could get for a twilight shot. So I'm happy with that. ISO 100, perfect world. An indoor shot with a speed light, which is the worst thing in the world you can do typically. Look, I lucked out on this shot. I think it still turned out well. This is at a homecoming in a gymnasium, and I was at ISO 500. I challenge you to find noise in this picture. It isn't there. And so even at 500, the gym that I shoot in most of the time, I'm shooting around ISO 3200. And now this is an example when my ISO is on auto. One end of the gym, the lighting is slightly different than it is at the other end of the court. And so I have to go to auto. So when when the player's at the other end of the gym, my ISO will jump up to about 5,000. And at this end of the gym, it'll drop back down to 3,200. I'm on auto. I'm going to let the camera do that for me. I don't want to have to reach up and turn the dial every time they're running from one end of the court to the other. But at 3,200 ISO, this picture here, you can't see noise. On social media, you won't see it. If I printed this thing out to a large poster size, or if this went on a billboard, yeah, you're going to see the noise. But my pictures aren't going to go on a billboard. So at 3,200, I don't have a problem with this noise issue. This is what I shot today. This in Tullahoma, this roastery. This company makes custom blend coffees. And I just had some coffee made for my Keurig, blended specifically for the Keurig machine. And so I'm going to experiment with that in the morning. But anyway, I was there to take some promo shots. He wants to put these on his website. And so I'm at ISO 800 on this. There's no noise in here. Unless maybe if you blew it up to maybe 400%, yeah, probably. But nobody's going to see it at 400%. So ISO 800. This again, I went to 3,200. I just shot this with available light. I'm at f4.5 because I wanted a little bit of depth of field from the coffee packs on the counter to the signage on the wall behind at 3,200. That's a clean shot. The only person or people who get excited about noise is other photographers. I've had some gallery exhibits. I've been very fortunate to display some of my work over the last couple of years. And at the gallery reception, I know who the photographers are. They will walk up within 12 inches of the picture or even closer, and they start looking at every little thing in the frame, everything. There was one individual at my last exhibit. His eyeball couldn't have been 4 inches away from the picture. Had to take his glasses off and was really examining. He's looking for noise and he's looking for detail and artifacts, et cetera. Well, good for him, because the person who buys that picture doesn't even know what noise is, and what are they doing? They're standing 4 feet or 3 feet away from the display on the wall. So noise is not a big deal. I'll shoot up to 3,200 with my camera and not worry about noise. I'd rather shoot it at 100, but I'd rather have an ISO of 3,200 and get the shot than be at ISO 100 and go, gee, that could have been a good shot. White balance, our time is up. So all I would say is on white balance, know where that adjustment is at. If you're shooting on a cloudy day, turn your white balance dial to cloudy. If you're shooting, photographing a person in the shade of a building, there's probably a shady setting, turn it to shady, or daylight. But be familiar with the white balance. An example of a correct white balance is somewhat a little bit of an overcast day. But if I did not make a compensation for that, I could get a really funny looking tint color to that picture. So be aware of the white balance. I've shot in auto white balance, and my camera is good about 80% of the time. That's a pretty high percentage. But there's that 20%, depending on what I'm shooting and why, I need to make sure that the guessing is out of the question. And so, but sometimes I'll shoot auto white balance. If I'm doing an event and I'm shooting under tungsten or fluorescent lighting, and then I'm going out onto a patio and I've got daylight, et cetera, I don't want to have to be hitting a button and changing this all the time. I'll change it to auto and I'll take my chances. But that is the exception. Again, I already touched on this. Single focus or continuous. Continuous certainly is when you've got motion and you want to stay locked in on that, keep the focus locked in. And then of course, manual. And for me, my style manual is more of a specialty. Very limited in my subjects where I go to manual. And then the focus point, that little square, whether it's green, whether it's red, or whether it's a red dot that blinks, that says you've got the correct focus, that you're locked in. Generally, I've got that on one focus point, and it's not always in the center. I might move it around to another point to get it on the subject, but I'm on one focus point. We have eagles nesting in Murfreesboro, which is where I'm at. And I blew it last year. I thought I want to make sure in case that eagle takes off, I want to make sure I've locked in on the focus. So I went to what is called zone focusing. So I had 9 squares in the center were all active. Well, as I'm focusing on the eagle sitting on the branch in the tree, those 9 spots kept blinking, going on and off, on and off. And I get home, I get on the computer, the branches, the tree trunk, everything except the eagle was in focus. The camera was selecting the wrong subject, the wrong area. And the eagles are nesting again. When I go back in the next day or two, I will be on a single focus. So that was a lesson learned on my part. Again, we touched on the timer, 2 seconds. If you're on a tripod, allow yourself time for that camera to shutter speed to, or tripod and camera to settle down. Now, if you're shooting at 250th, 500ths of a second, that's probably not a big deal. I have programmed the buttons on my camera for my use. I, because these are the things I'm changing all the time. Forget the exposure compensation at the bottom. That's another class. But I do change that quite a bit. But I know exactly where those dials and buttons and switches are. And I can get to it without moving my eye away from the viewfinder. I don't even have to be looking at it. There is some muscle memory involved. When I went to my newest camera that I got late last year, it was slightly different than what I had before. A couple of buttons were in a different place. Some of the button sizes were a little bit different. It just felt different. It took me about a week of doing some dry runs, just sitting in my favorite chair with the camera in my hand and with the camera up to my eye and start searching for the buttons and making my changes and dials. I know when it's time to change the ISO dial. I don't have, it's up in the upper top left of my camera. And I know that if I turn that dial clockwise, I'm increasing my ISO. If I turn it counterclockwise, I'm decreasing the ISO. I don't want to get in a situation where I've got to change my ISO and I go, well, which way do I turn it? Do I turn it up or down to get to where I want? I already know. Same way with my shutter. I know that if I want to increase the shutter speed, I turn it counterclockwise, and so on. I just know that. One of the buttons I push, my white balance menu will pop up so I can make the selection. Another button on the back, I programmed it to know where my timer is at and my focus points, etc. So if your camera allows you to program your buttons, think about what are the things I change most often and how do I want to get to those changes? And then all I can say is just start practicing. That's simply what it takes. Your photography gets better when you go out and shoot. This time of the year, I don't do well this time of the year. The weather, I get a little bit demotivated personally to go out and shoot. Things are drab and dreary. And so I do a lot of portrait and portrait work this time of the year. So I stay busy that way. But other than that, you just got to practice. You just got to practice. So having said all of that, and I apologize for the 7 minutes that I ran over, maybe you'll forgive me. Is there anything that I'm able to address this evening? Any burning questions?
There's nothing in the chat room right now that hasn't been addressed. So if you would like to just unmute yourself, you can either click the unmute button or you can press the space bar on your keyboard and hold it down kind of like a walkie-talkie, but feel free to ask questions.
I know it's a lot of information in a short amount of time. And so some of these topics we'll delve into a little bit deeper in some of the other classes. No questions. Was I that good, Jeremy?
So yeah, and if you're a little shy about asking questions, I'm still watching the chat room. Lots of people saying thank you, Gale. Great class, very helpful information. But feel free to put a message in the chat room if you would like to do that as well too, and I'll watch for those.
I have a question, Gale. What cameras do you recommend for somewhat amateur photographers? I currently have a Nikon D3300 and I'm thinking about upgrading. I do a lot of photography for Central Magnet and in their athletics program. And I'm not quite sure what the next best thing would be for a semi-amateur person.
Oh, wow. That's a pretty open question.
Gale, do you mind if I take that one?
Yeah, go ahead, Jeremy.
And the reason I say that is because the D5300 was actually my first camera.
Oh.
Gale and I both are shooting Fuji now. But what I found, the answer for me was when I started to realize that I was trying to do things the camera wouldn't allow me to do. Just things like, I think you'll hear, I don't know if Gale covers this, but one of the things that a lot of photographers do is change their settings so that you can use back button focus. Didn't have that capability in that camera. And for what I was using it for, that was a limitation for me. Not having some of the dials to be able to easily change some of those settings that Gale talked about tonight, I found that camera became a limitation for me. So it was because I actually could definitively say to somebody, it's not because I'm chasing the gear, like Gale says, like as photographers, we love to have the latest and greatest in many cases. But I could definitively say that I could not do certain things with that camera. And so that's when I made the decision to upgrade. And I went from the I went to the 750. Actually, the Nikon D750 was the next camera that I went to after that. So I had another camera in between there before I went to the Fuji. I shoot landscape, so you know, a lot of people that are shooting landscape like Fuji. So that was one of the reasons that I switched. I love Nikons, nothing wrong with them, nothing wrong with Canons. You can ask any photographer what the best camera is for anything, and they'll probably give you an opinion, and they're all right and they're all wrong. It goes back to one of the things Gale said early on. If you know how to use the camera, you can take great pictures with it. But you can have a $6,000 camera and you can take a ton of crappy pictures with it. Because if you don't understand how to use it, and if you don't understand some of the basic composition techniques that Gale's going to talk about throughout these lessons, you're going to miss out because you've got an expensive piece of something that doesn't really do what it needs to, because the person behind the camera doesn't know what they're doing or how to use the camera effectively.
Yeah, I went. I was a Canon guy. That's where I started. I started with a Canon, and that's only because when I walked into the camera store, the salesman that's what he used, and he talked. He said, "Yeah, the Canon is what you want." Well, the Canon, Nikon, Sony now, and Fuji wasn't really a player way back then when I bought the Canon. It did everything I wanted it to do at that time. When I started evolving, doing more sports, my Canon would not give me enough. When I went into burst mode, I was only getting the Canon that I had. I was getting 3 frames a second. There's a lot of stuff that goes on between between a frame. And one of the reasons why I went with the Fuji, uh, for me personally, is because of the frame rate. My camera shoots at 14 frames a second. So when I hold that shutter button down in 1 second, I've got 14 pictures. One of those 14 is going to be the right shot. Hopefully, it'll be the right shot. But just bottom line is it increases my chances in getting the shot that I'm wanting. So that was important to me. So that's why I leaned toward the camera manufacturer and model that I went with. But you just have to, what are the features that you need to know, what features you use most often, and how you would use it. And does that camera give you those options? I won't tell you the brand of camera that I bought before the Fuji, but it was the first generation of a mirrorless camera. I had to go through like a menu, sub menu, sub menu to change the ISO. It was ridiculous. There was nothing on the body of the camera that allowed you to do it. You had to push the button in the back to pull up the menu, and then you had to start searching. And it was the most. A photographer did not design the functions of that camera. That was the engineer. And so I gave it, within 6 months, that was on eBay, and then I went with what I'm using now. So it's you just gotta and take one. Is it lens rental?
Yeah, I've used them before. I used them when I went to Europe. I rented 6 lenses and took them with me and tried out.
Great way to do it. I rented a lens for my Fuji for my sports photography. I rented it, and the very first game, I realized this was not going to work. This lens would not focus quick enough. By the time the lens focused in on the play was off, already over.
Yeah.
And so it took me 3 days to figure that out. And so I spent a few dollars to know that, and saved myself about 800. And
Yeah. And see,
so
I do a lot of indoor swimming photos for Central. At the present moment, I do track, archery, swim, and soccer. So I'm trying to find something that has a good balance with that, that has the shutter speed to get the action shots and keep the focus. I'm just now getting into portrait.
okay, I would say with your action shots, I would look for something that has a minimum of 10 frames a second.
Okay. All right. Thank you. That was very helpful. I appreciate it. And by the
Okay.
way, fantastic class.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. This is a quiet group, Jeremy.
Yeah, I think we'll give them a lot to think about tonight, and especially like I said, if you're a new person to this, there's a lot of detail in that, and it kind of warps your brain a little bit. But once you get around it and understand it, and then that really comes through practice, like you said, it starts to click, and the next thing you know, it's just a matter of going out and shooting, taking images anywhere and everywhere, whether it's indoors, outdoors, and just continuing to kind of develop your skill set.
And be patient. Just be patient. If you try these things we talked about and it doesn't give you the result you're looking for, just take a breath and change a setting. Do something else until you dial it in. This is not brain surgery. And the beauty of the digital camera, you can I shot this portrait shoot yesterday, and I came away with about 80 shots. Of those 80 shots, I had about 30 that did not work. I didn't have my lighting right. My depth of field was off. As we changed poses, I had to change settings, and sometimes I was forgetting to change certain settings on the camera. I would take the shot, and it would be a black screen on the back of and I scratch my head and go, "What did I just do?" And so you just push forward through it, and so you're going to make mistakes. You're not. Well, I'll just say for me, it took me a while to start getting it all wrapped around in my brain to where I could start functioning and feel relatively comfortable. I still make mistakes. When I shot that beanery today, I made I forgot to change my ISO between the speed light on the camera and shooting natural light, available light, and the ISO needed to change. And I would take a shot, and I'd have a black screen. I go, "What did I just do? Nothing's changed." Well, yes, it did. I turned off my speed light, and I forgot to change the ISO. And so it still happens, and I do a fair amount of shooting. So just be patient, and just know it's a learning process. And for those in this group tonight, you've been shooting for 20 years, you would probably attest that it is a learning. It's always a learning process. It never ends. But that's the excitement of photography.
Gail, I don't think you go into lighting, do you? External lighting, like speed lights or anything like that?
No, not in this series.
Okay.
No.
All right. Well, I don't see anything else in chat. So this is probably a good place to stop. We thank everybody that joined us this evening. Like I said earlier, we'll have the link out to everybody that signed up, not just the ones that participated on line live tonight. We'll get that out to you within the next 48 hours. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out either to Gale, or you can email me, president@brentwoodphotographygroup.org. You can find that on our website as well too, under the photography basics page. There's some of the contact information there. we thank you again for spending some time with us this evening, and we look forward to seeing you next month. I believe the date is actually March 9th, so it's a month from tonight. So we will see you then,
Hey,
and have a good evening.
thanks, everybody.
Good night.
Have a good night.
You too.